Thank you, Angela. Thank you all for coming. It would be very cold if you weren't here, I think, so it's good that you're here. Some of that I was going to say, so I don't have to say that bit, but it did occur to me earlier that I did start my research career working for BECTA, so the British Educational Communications, I can't remember what it all stood for, which then was abolished quite soon afterwards. And then I worked for the National College of Leadership that was also disbanded afterwards. So anyone who works here be worried, I suspect. So yeah, what I've got throughout the presentation are pictures that may or may not have something to do with what I'm talking about. And that might be up to you to decide, really. I think this picture, there's a reference that comes up later. It's kind of optimistic for me. So I'm trying to I was thinking about the future and the future of schools and schooling. It's a bit grim out there. It's a bit grim in the world at the moment. So the blue skies are supposed to be kind of positive to a certain extent. What I was also going to say is there is no, although you've got your phones on silent, there's no mobile phone ban here. In fact, you will need your mobile phones at some point later. So be ready and excited about that. More positive blossom. What I was going to say is that for me, most people in education research start out as teachers of some kind or practitioners. And somehow I avoided that. I don't know quite how that happened, but I got into education research, it was 20 or something years ago, which is quite scary. And because I've generally done funded research, that's why I've had the opportunity to do it to all of those things Anna just mentioned. So from little people up to much older people, which is kind of a privilege. And for me, it kind of shows, I think education for me is a really open discipline that can have disadvantages and advantages. I think it means that all things are possible, but it also means there are probably more questions than answers, and that's what all researchers say. But so there'll be some answers maybe later on. What I'm going to do, what to expect today, there's a little bit about theory, and we're in a university, so we have to have some theory, but it's linked to practice, and we can think about whether theory is practice or whether practice is theory. There's some speculation, as you might expect. Some photographs. I wanted to play some music, but it was the rights are too difficult to get, so there's no music, unfortunately. Maybe it isn't working now. There's some data and some graphs because I wanted to appeal to everybody. There may be frustration and disbelief. If there is, then I want it to be kind of with me rather than at me. There will be some audience participation. So it's partly from having worked on things like learning and teaching for a long time. I'm slightly suspicious of somebody standing up and talking for an hour or so and not getting something back. So we'll see how that works out, really. And as I keep saying, hope. So there's some hope at the end, but there may be some ups and downs on the way. So what I think about futures. Originally, as I said, people don't start out in education as education researchers. They come from a discipline or an area. Where I came from initially was kind of around languages and literature a long time ago. So I'm kind of interested in languages and etymology. So I kind of thought, well, what does an inaugural mean? What does augural mean? And if you look it up, it goes back to a Roman religious official who interpreted omens derived from the behavior of birds, which is obviously got some advice from that person there. And soothsayers, diviners, and prophets. So I think that's quite an exciting thing to be getting into. The OED says it's about significance of the future. So obviously, inaugurals is about looking to the future. So that's kind of my justification, I think. Nick Pime, who's an interesting education researcher, says education habitually emphasizes the realization of potential. So that's a kind of forward-looking thing. And technology also kind of looks towards the future, but often it's kind of novelty. So a bit like politics and the media. Technology always wants to do new things, what Holland Barth called neomania. And when you get those two things coming together of technology and education, which is one of the things I'm interested in, and I'll be talking about, it's kind of odd happens. So education over the last, depending how you look at it, 20, 30, 40 years has been even more focused on economics and instrumental approaches, getting young people ready for what used to be industry is now kind of the work and careers. Technology is kind of set up to resolve things and sort out all of our problems out. If only it were that easy. And when you bring them together, something strange happens, which I'm not sure is that positive. So we'll see that. And there's a couple of theorists. So Franco Berardi, he's called Biffo, which I think is, I don't know why he's called Biffo, but he has this quite influential phrase of the future's been cancelled. We don't have the way, if you think back even, depends how old you are, but those of us who grew up in the 70s and 80s, there was more kind of hope for the future than there is at the moment. And Alan Finlayson, who's a professor of politics, talks about having an occluded future. What kind of future do we have? And that seems to be quite worrying if you're somebody either working in a school as a teacher or young people learning at the moment. So we'll hopefully, we'll see what comes with that, really. Technology is set up in different ways, particularly in relation to education. Here's a quote I found a few years ago, which I quite like. I'll read it out. The real low point for me was a few months ago when the greatest artists and writers were invited to Downing Street to be told by some prat from Wolverhampton that information technology is culture. Now, I used to work in Wolverhampton. I wasn't that prat, but he then went on to say, on the contrary, it's a delivery system like a telephone. It has bugger all to do with culture. And that was Sir John Drummond, who was a kind of arts administrator. He was a Radio 3 controller. I think he was in charge of the Edinburgh Festival for a while when it went from being a small thing to a big thing. I think he was wrong. I think in 2000 he was wrong. He died soon after that. Nothing to do with this, I don't think. But I think it's even more incorrect now because information technology is a culture and it's more than a delivery system because of the way that it has kind of insinuated itself into our lives. And that's kind of why I think I'm interested in the digital and what we call the post-digital, which I will kind of go into, explain to you. Obviously, we know what digital and digital technology is. It's what we all have, what our phones on, what's making this technology work on screen. The post-digital is looking at things slightly differently. So the kind of origins are at the end of the 20th century, around the time that that guy was talking about Wolverhampton. That Nicholas Negroponte said, like air and drinking water, being digital will be noticed only by its absence, not its presence. And we're kind of there, I think, because, if your internet connection goes down, you panic, don't you? You can't get Netflix anymore. You can't send texts and emails. And obviously drinking water is another issue, which we won't get onto. It's declined since 1998. This is a very influential quote from Petr Jandrich and colleagues writing about post-digital education and so post-digital science and education, which is quite useful for me. I think we're increasingly no longer in a world where digital technology and media are separate, virtual, other to a natural human and social life. So we can't exist without technology, everything we do. The increasingly no longer seems interesting because if it's no longer, how can something be increasingly no longer? But it kind of makes sense because we are more entwined with technology than we used to be. And to try and get a kind of understanding of what the post-digital is, Sriano kind of has three perspectives on it, and they're quite influential. One is ubiquity, so technology is everywhere. I think everyone would agree that there's no escape from, even if you don't have a phone, there's data being collected on you. The other thing about the post-digital is criticality. So a lot of the work around technology generally, but particularly around technology and education for the last 20, 30 years, has been kind of positive and not positivist, positive and utopian. This is going to solve everything. You hear that about AI now. AI is going to solve our problems. I'll come back to that later. What those of us working from a kind of post-digital perspective are trying to do is have a strong criticality about that. What does it mean to be living in this post-digital world? And the last thing, it is a kind of active, sometimes an activist objective. Which is about the post-digital is something that people may be aiming at, but you're never going to get there. That kind of idea that understanding the way that these technologies work for us. And these points are important for me that it's kind of against a simplified view of the world, which we increasingly up against. It's against having a binary approach. I mean, digital is binary. The way I look at it as post-digital is against that kind of binary, yes or no, right or wrong, that kind of thing, and against the purified phenomena. It's not interested in kind of pure anything because things aren't pure. Things are mixed up. Things are complex. And so if you're interested, a lot of this work is published in the Post-Digital Science and Education Journal, where colleagues of mine have been involved in it for a lot longer than I have. I've been trying to kind of play around with the academic publishing. So I'm having collective articles. So sometimes the article's like 50 pages long, and you have people writing 500 words. So that it's to kind of subvert that peer review process, but have it as rigorous as anything else. So it's about people working together. Things like dialogue is really important. So it's about having dialogue with participants involved in research, having them involved in the writing process, the kind of participatory approaches, those kind of things. And I think that makes it difficult for things like REF, the university, the way that universities are assessed. But it's good to kind of subvert some of that to a certain extent, because REF is only one way of publishing things. And there are other ways of doing it too. Right, this is the tricky bit. It's tricky for me to describe. It's hard to get your head around this. I'm not sure I have entirely, actually, but I quite like the fact I haven't. The post bit in post-digital is elusive. So there are people who kind of were first involved in determining what, coming up with this idea of post-digital, but digital saying, well, it's not about after. So we've had digital technologies for decades, if not a century. I think the first reference to digital education is to do with dentistry in the 19th century, about digital as in using your fingers, because dentists have to use their fingers. But there's a kind of technological element to that. Post-digital doesn't, well, some people say it doesn't at all mean it's after, because these things are all mixed up. I think there is a sense in which we're in a context where we're so used to digital that it is an after. There's an after to it. But there's another sense that I've borrowed from Robert Young, who wrote about post-structuralism in the 80s. Post also means behind. So the sense of proscenium in a theatre, that's the bit that's behind the stage. So it's not just about after. There's a mixing up of these temporalities and spaces, which I find quite interesting and exciting theoretically to get my handle. But I might be just quite strange that way. I don't know. There's a quote here from Nicholas Royal, who's a professor across the road at Sussex, from 1999, saying that postisms are defined by not being something else. So we have all of these things like post-truth. What does post-truth mean? It's not truth. I'm trying to think of the other post. Postmodernism was defined, although people would contest it, as being not modernism. So you kind of think, well, that's a strange thing if you think about it. How are they defined by not being something? Post-punk is one that is interesting, because post-punk wasn't punk, but it's different to punk if you're interested in post-punk. I could talk about that for a long time, but I won't. And here, another quote from a kind of a critical theorist, Jeff Bennington, who did teach me at Sussex when I studied at Sussex. So to a certain extent, the university across the road is to blame for me being interested in this kind of critical theory. But he said, and I think this is an important point, post-theory can easily become an excuse not to think very hard. And so it's become a thinly made up return to pre-theoretical habits, because you say, oh, we're past that all now. And in fact, the way I think, one of the reasons that I'm interested in the post-digital is I think it's quite open and hospitable to all kinds of theories. You can kind of play with theories, bring them. One thing I've been interested in is using kind of theory, well, a lot of people do this, but theories about kind of radical education from the 60s and 70s, because there are interesting ideas there, but things didn't necessarily work out. But it doesn't mean we should dismiss those kind of theories and bring them together, a new kind of theoretical constellation. The entanglement bit, and the picture was supposed to be an entanglement. I think it kind of works. I don't know. You hear a lot about entanglement. Nobody actually explains what entanglement really means. It's like a code word. It's kind of saying, I'm interested in theory, I think. And and its roots, because I looked at the etymology of it, go back to the kind of colonial exploitation of Columbus. So I think the first use of it are about Columbus and people associate with him going to Central America and getting tangled up in the seaweed when they were trying to get either to wherever they were going in Central America or away before they were killed. So, but there's there's all kinds of theories, post-humanist theories, socio-material theories about we are all entangled. There's no way out from the complexity of the world we're in. Part of that is digital, which is why I'm interested in the post-digital, but it's broader than that. And I think to a certain extent, the kind of simplicities we have around politics of, you're either for immigration or against immigration, or the kind of Brexit thing, are a way of simplifying all of these, the kind of complexity and entanglement we're in. I don't know if that makes any sense. It kind of makes sense to me. I'm getting some nods, so maybe a little bit. But I think what's useful is trying to think these things through without necessarily thinking there are going to be any answers to anything. So it's not as simple as that. Okay, there's a little bit more theory, and then we'll not have any more. They're just two book chapters. It's slightly embarrassing to put them up, but drawing on kind of post-digital theory that I and my colleague Pete Bennett have written over the last few years. The first one, the global pandemic, didn't take place. We weren't denying it. We weren't against vaccination. When we wrote that, it was about the fact that it seems that people were already trying to move on and deny that anything had happened. I think we wrote that in 2021. That seems to have come to pass, I think. Even though there was the report today on the pandemic and the pandemic response, which seems, from what I can see, very critical. We've kind of almost forgotten that the pandemic happened, which is quite worrying because it's such a big thing. It's such a big thing for young people, I think, who were in school at the time and are working their way through the education system. I won't talk about the other one just now. What we do in those chapters, to a certain extent, and there's another one in the middle that I didn't have a picture for, is taking on some of the myths and tensions that are around education, particularly school education, and to kind of see what's going on there. And we're kind of, if you think about myths, you have to go back to Roland Barthes, really, and mythologies that he wrote in the 50s. His quote I quite like: myth doesn't deny things, it purifies them, that word again. It makes them innocent, and it organizes a world which is without contradictions because it's without depth. That's the kind of world we're in, I think, often. The world, certainly the world outside universities, which is alarming. Nick Pime, who I quoted before, his point, I think it's a good point, is education, he says, is the master myth of our time. It encompasses everything. Everything is about education. Education is supposed to resolve all problems. If you think of, going back to New Labour and education, that wasn't a coincidence that was the kind of myth, to a certain extent, that was put forth at that point. So I've got three myths and tensions that I'm going to talk about briefly to try and exemplify some of what we're trying to get at with the post-digital already. One is between disadvantage and privilege, how that plays out, between learning and progress, and between privacy and data, which is obviously a key part of what I'm talking about in terms of the digital. Before that, I've got some graphs, because it's always good to have a graph. And this is based on OECD data, so we could argue about how accurate it is. There are always caveats with this kind of data. What it shows is expenditure on educational institutions by education level, so public spending. And if you look at that, and I don't quite know how they or why they do this, but it links all the UK countries into one UK, even though, as we know, the education systems are different in the four constituent countries of the UK. But what you can see there, which I think is interesting, is the UK is 6th in terms of spending proportion of GDP on education on 2022 data, which is pretty high, I think, really. the highest European country that isn't in Scandinavia. And we know that Scandinavians do everything better than we do, really. But if you can kind of see how it is. What's interesting, Norway spends the most, so nearly 8% of GDP, which is huge. In terms of the constituent parts, the UK, as shown here, spends more in nearly every area, certainly on tertiary kind of HE, spends more than Norway does, proportionately. Where we do really badly, you can see that, is on the bottom blue bit, which is early childhood education. We spend hardly anything as a proportion, and much lower than, looking at these, I think there's a couple of countries, Japan spends less, and Ireland. It's complicated slightly by the fact that we have a weird private-public mix in terms of early years education. So, which, you know, free child places wouldn't necessarily appear on here, and vouchers and all those kind of things. But it does say something about, I mean, we spend a lot of money, but we don't seem to necessarily spend it in the right place. There's a lot of research that shows that spending, some of it's problematic, but the amount of money you spend on early years education gives you a better kind of bang for your buck than it does later on. I'm aware I'm standing in a university, so I probably shouldn't criticise the amount of funding, because we know what the funding situation is for universities at the moment. But it's interesting that the UK it spends a lot more than the OECD average. And, you know, this kind of comparison for me is quite useful because it asks questions. It doesn't actually resolve anything, I don't think. But there's something interesting about the way that the UK distributes its kind of income on education. And the second one, this is the last slide of the last graph slide. Changes in the child poverty rate. This is UNICEF data, 2012-14 to 2019 to 21. It's interesting, but here, slightly worryingly, the UK wins. So our child poverty rate has gone up more than anywhere else on UNICEF data for countries comparable countries that they look at. So nearly 20% rise in child poverty rates, which is shows what we're kind of, well, that's austerity talking, really, I think. It's interesting if you look at the countries that have reduced child poverty, they're the kind of post-Soviet bloc countries. So they've done something interesting between since 2012 to 2014 that if we were to look at trying to replicate, and there are all kinds of caveats, we can't, you know, we used to go to look at Sweden or Finland and try and do what they do. It's not as simple as that. If it was as simple as that, we would all do it. But there's something going, particularly these countries like Estonia, in terms of digital education, Estonia is doing all kinds of really interesting things. It's a small country, but it's got limited resources. It seems to be on the kind of measures that people like me stand up, and PISA measures that say they're all nonsense. We shouldn't look at them. But on those kind of measures, if you look at them, Estonia does really well, better than Finland, I think, these days, where you see Finland is they haven't reduced child poverty in recent time. Slovenia also is an interesting country that was the picture at the beginning. That was in Slovenia. By coincidence, really. I didn't go there because Slovenia, I don't do this kind of tourism of countries that reduce child poverty. Well, that'd be quite interesting to do. So I don't know, there's something quite shameful about the fact that the UK is there at the end. We have a different government now, though, you know, reducing child poverty is more of a imperative than it was, but we shall see what happens with that, really. So when I talk about digital and post-digital, this all kind of plays out in that arena as well, because if we have those levels of poverty or child poverty, then because education, but all kind of services are more digital than they used to be, then if you're disadvantaged, you have less access to educational resources and all kinds of resources as well. So there are problems here, I think, that we are storing up for ourselves in the UK. The UK isn't an education system, but England always does things in more extreme ways than the other countries in the UK in terms of marketisation, those kind of things. So we're not getting very hopeful at this point, so we'll try and bring it up a little bit in terms of positiveness. Well, that's not a very positive picture, is it? But I quite like it. In terms of disadvantage and privilege, the digital, some of the research that I've been involved in and other people have done have shown that digital inequality kind of exacerbates and magnifies inequality and poverty generally. So, but we don't understand that particularly well. So here, Kuhn and colleagues, the super complex nature of digital equality has been underplayed and under-theorized. This was written before the pandemic. There's another quote. Again, this focusing on a perpetual focus on the new in policy for technology has unfortunately drawn attention away from many ongoing inequalities in education. Both written in 2019. One thing that was interesting from the pandemic is that the pandemic really kind of shone a light on these kind of issues, because when suddenly everybody had to go online in terms of schooling, particularly, the extremes of poverty were kind of suddenly much more obvious. So there were all kinds of things that was playing out in terms of equipment, families not having laptops or tablets or anything to kind of access the online learning that was available. There was a real problem with space. So, children not having anywhere to go to engage with the sudden move onto in terms of online learning. And a head teacher that I know was going around putting money in the meters because people didn't have enough money didn't have electricity to be able to charge up equipment and be able to access online learning. Certainly the head teacher that I know didn't know that the levels of poverty were quite as extreme as that. So it had in some ways you could think that that's positive, but the problem is when education is becoming more digitized and it's becoming more important, then that what still gets called the digital divide is getting wider, and it's linked with all those kind of divides that we have in terms of achievement and attainment in schools. I wasn't expecting that one to come there. It's there, so it is. Data and privacy. This is from the Human Data Interaction book that I noticed when Angela read the title. That title is far too long. We should have cut that title down. It's far too complicated. What we were interested in there is talking to people who worked with young people from disadvantaged or difficult backgrounds about how young people engage with data and how they supported young people to understand what's happening with data. There's so much data collected on all of us, and we don't know what's happening with it. So one point here is that even those people who can't or do not wish to access digital technologies will still find they're being accessed anyway. There's data being collected. I think England is the most surveilled country in the world still. So there's data, wherever you go. Other countries have data protection rules on that. We don't. I don't quite understand how that's happened. We don't want ID cards, but we're happy to be surveilled everywhere we go. This is a nice quote, which is from the Human Data Interaction book. Parents lose any control they have over their child's digital footprint simply by allowing them to go to school, because the amount of data that schools collect and gather is astonishing. And I don't think parents have an understanding of what that means. Certainly schools don't have a very good understanding of how much data, what happens with the data they collect either, which is slightly problematic. So the tension there between data and the privacy, do we have any control over, should we have any control over what data is collected on us, and then what happens to it? So there's a huge infiltration really of schools, universities as well, all kinds of educational organizations, by commercial tech firms who are collecting huge amounts of money. And we've got to think, is that a positive thing? Schools don't know what's necessarily if that's a good thing or not. And there's a huge amount of privacy issues. And then the last tension I want to quickly flag up is learning and progress. So the obsession, I think, is with improving progress and being able to predict children's progress. So we have all of these things that are fairly new developments. I don't know if you've come across any of these. Precision education, which Brunilla and Nering from Finland write about, this idea that and it links into some of the other ideas here, trying to improve the way that children learn so it can be predicted very tightly. And it links into the area of educational genomics as well. Biodigital education, these things that there are really scary things going on in the US at the moment about genome sequencing and allowing parents to choose kind of genetic, how the genes of their children will, which in embryos, how the genes of their children will be selected, those kind of things, in order to improve their prospects, supposedly, in terms of education and then in life. Ben Williamson there has written all kinds of interesting articles about that. And the I can't remember her name now, her first name, but the Harden, she's a geneticist, and she wrote an interesting book about trying to bring together genetics and sociology. So trying to think, well, actually, and she makes a good point, is that those of us in social sciences tend to dismiss genetics, say, oh, it's all either nonsense or scary. But there is work in genetics going on, and it's being increasingly influential in education, particularly in the States. But it's if it's in the States, it's coming to us as well. It's kind of, so some people talk about biology now being a branch of IT. The point is that we don't know what's going on. It's kind of like one of these black boxes that we get all the time. What's going on in terms of educational genomics? And then there are these ideas that I've written about in relation to post-digital schools of platformization, datafication, algorithmization, which are all quite hard to say. Lots of platforms from companies like, the big companies like Google, Microsoft, Pearson, etc., that are changing the way that schools work. And I'm not sure, well, I am sure actually that teachers aren't necessarily aware of what's going on, where the data's going. Parents certainly aren't. There's all kinds of research about the datafication of children. So, we are much more data than we think we are. That's where the post-digital thing comes in. Where do we stop as humans? Where do we stop and where do we start becoming data? And I mean, we saw during the pandemic 2021, when GCSE results were calculated by algorithms, that didn't work out very well, did it really? And what happened after? It's hard to think back. It's not that long ago, but it's like another world. We went back to teacher assessment, and then everyone went up in arms. Oh no, the results have got up. You think, well, that's probably because the algorithms didn't work very well. But that's not going to go away. That's going to kind of keep coming back. So my point on this is that, this kind of focus on prediction is opposed to learning, really. So learning is about risks. It's about unpredictability and uncertainty. That's how we learn. If certain people are trying to nail everything down so that nothing is left to chance, then where's the learning in that, really? And then there's another quote from Roland Barthes, because I like him. In the teaching space, nobody should be anywhere in his place. So it's about thinking, it's not about being comfortable, because we don't learn when we're comfortable. That's kind of what going to school's about, going to university is about, learning new things and doing new things. I'm conscious of time now, so I'm not going to read this out, but this is from the research that I did a couple of years ago into the post-digital school, and the point of, that's from a deputy CEO of a multi-academy trust, who basically said, education's still Victorian. Schools look Victorian. I mean, we did have building schools of the future, but that stopped quite quickly. And most schools look like they did. Most schools are really, really old. But what basically he's saying is that in schools, it's people like me standing up like I am now talking, and that's not how children learn anymore. And he was quite conscious of the fact that, having been in education for 30 years, things have the distance between children's lives and what goes on in school is much greater than it used to be. And something has to change there. That was his view, certainly. And that's the view that we had from that research. Moving on quickly, moral panics, tulip mania. I can't remember why, I like that picture, but I can't remember why I put it on there now. This is the audience participation bit. So it's been a long time coming. The problem is if you do research in technology, technology never works. So I'm slightly reluctant about this. But you have there a QR code and a URL. You can see where it takes you and then answer the question. There we go. Live, real-time data. I dream of this kind of thing. Okay, everyone finished? So you're a very progressive audience, aren't you? Do you think mobile phones should be banned in schools? 20% yes, 55% no, 25% not sure. Interesting. I'm not going to ask anyone to say anything more, but I kind of expect. Oh, 18%. It's coming down now. Oh no, it's up. It's exciting, isn't it? I think if you ask the general public, it would be reversed. If not reversed, quite a long way in the other direction. But we'll come back to that in a second. And there's another one. I spent a long time thinking how to divide that up. Hourly, daily, often but less than daily. Rarely, 15%, that's good. I won't ask who that is. What it is. So everybody has a mobile phone. Everybody uses it at work or would do if they were working. And more than half of you use it hourly. That says something, doesn't it? That's the post-digital in I'm going to say a nutshell, but that doesn't seem very digital to me. The rhetoric about schools is banning mobile phones from schools, which, whatever it was, 22% of people were keen of. There's all kinds of, I'll just say very quickly, 21%. It depends what you mean by schools. So there's a difference between primary and secondary, I would say. But what's interesting for me about mobile, there's kind of three elements, really. One is this kind of a respect thing in that I don't think we're unrepresentative. If as adults we use our mobile phones hourly at work, then we're kind of modeling that way of living. And then we're saying to kids, you can't do that. So it's disrespectful. We probably should ask young people what they want to do, because I think young people will also say they don't want to, if they're learning, they don't want to be on their phones all the time, but you learn through a mobile phone as well. And an awful lot of the research about children who teachers think are distracted in the classroom, not by phones, but generally, shows that they are much more likely to be on task than teachers think, because there's all kind of prejudices and biases that go on there. There's a practical element to it. Rather than banning phones, shouldn't we be helping young people to kind of improve their literacy about when to use mobile phones, how they can be used? They are, a powerful tool. And either the most important or the least important, depending on your perspective, is that there's no evidence that banning mobile phones works. In fact, the evidence that there is, and it's patchy, shows the opposite. Schools that have banned mobile phones tend to do worse on the kind of measures like attainment measures that you can use. So there's something strange going on there, I think. And also mobile phones, how can we ban? They're part of reality, aren't they? It's like we might want to ban nuclear weapons, but we can't. They're there. So banning mobile phones seems a very kind of reactive and disrespectful response, really, to me. The other thing linked to this, you got to talk about AI because it's everywhere, isn't it? What I've done very quickly is some quotes, just some headlines about AI that are quite illuminating. So The Guardian, people's fear AI is eroding their ability to study. Research finds, got to have that bit in there. Don't think they said which research it was. The Telegraph one's great. Forget smartphones and wokery. You got to get wokery in there. There's an even greater threat to our children's education, and we know what that is. It's AI. Schools Week, public divided over AI use in schools, which is more accurate and interesting, perhaps, I think. Excuse me. Helen Beaton, a kind of education researcher, is quite provocative on this, saying artificial intelligence is the opposite of education. We could make a case for that being true. This is quite a famous article. ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the web. I read that article. I still don't understand what that means, but it's something about, we think that if we ask a question of ChatGPT naively, that it gives us an answer that's useful. And it's a kind of strange, mixed response you get. This is a German journalist, which is why it's about Swiss cheese, maybe. The AI bubble is a Swiss cheese, which is saying there is an AI bubble. There's a lot behind. AI is about money, largely. It's about making money for people in California and other countries, possibly. There's a bubble, it will burst at some point, and his point is we don't know whether, is it going to be the cheese or is it going to be the hole at the end of it? It's a kind of German thing. And my favourite one of all comes from Le Monde. Artificial intelligence is sparking a sexual revolution. It makes you want to go and live in France, I think, that kind of thing. It's even better in French. L'intelligence artificielle fait sa révolution sexuelle. I practiced that bit. It's a really boring article, actually. I did read it. They say at the end, we're going to need each other. Humans. AI isn't going to replace humans in terms of intimacy, should we put it that way? But what's interesting for me, quickly say a couple of things on AI. I'm kind of wary of it. I've been writing something about AI recently. It's really hard to do because there's so much hype about it. And the reality is kind of not there yet. We had a webinar yesterday with some of the PGR students where a colleague of mine who works on mobile and digital learning referred to AI as a massive version of autocomplete. I think that's true. And we know how good autocomplete is when you're writing a text. So we need to be more skeptical about it. I had somebody on a podcast refer to it as AI as a sonic screwdriver for politicians. Because politicians think it's going to solve, everything. And we have what Crawford, who's written books on AI, kind of calls enchanted determinism. So basically, this is what happens a lot with technology. It's either going to solve all our problems or it's going to kill us. And AI is the most extreme version of that. I suspect it's not going to do either of those things, certainly not in the short term. But there are all kinds of issues. There are ethical issues about where, as we know, where AI has got its data. There are accuracy issues. So some alarming stories coming up about if you type in certain questions, it will give some very problematic answers, encouraging people to do things like encouraging people to commit suicide, that kind of things. And this idea, of it hallucinating, which basically means coming up with nonsense, that seems to be almost kind of accepted. And if humans hallucinate, then we try and help them, don't we? But we kind of accept that with AI. So I know that schools are struggling with AI, and of the research I've done. And I also know that children and young people are streets ahead of schools in using it. So something has to be done. There's this big gap between what schools are allowed to do or what schools are able to do, and what young people do and what they're able to learn, I think. Coming towards the end now. So this one, I had a picture and I couldn't use it because I couldn't get the copyright for it. But and this is me trying to, for the last 5 minutes or so, clarify for myself and for you what postdigital means. So the picture was that, which I'm allowed to hold this up because I bought it, not when it came out, but and the reason why I'm holding ABBA, partly talk about kind of ABBA. For me, I went with my daughter, who's sitting here, last year to see ABBA Voyage, and I was like, anyone who's been to see ABBA Voyage? Anyone disappointed with it? It's fantastic. And I went along, a bit like sometimes I go to football matches, with my kind of researcher perspective on things. I'm going to research, I'm not going to be taken in by this. And, usually if a goal's scored in a football match, then I get excited. And at ABBA Voyage, I was thinking, this is really odd, but really interesting. And it is so post-digital. And it's kind of in there in ABBA from the beginning, because if you see, this is a really odd thing. This is me getting slightly self-indulgent, but, if you can't do that now, when can you? That's ABBA's greatest hits, came out in 1976, when they hadn't had any hits, really, only a couple. That's a really odd picture to have on, in terms of, we knew there were couples. These were the two that were married, and these were the two that weren't at the time. And I just think there's a kind of dialectic there, which they were ahead of the game then, in 1970s, nearly 50 years ago. And with ABBA Voyage, they're ahead of the game again. And I was kind of thinking, it could only have been ABBA, really. Who else would it have been? Because they are part of everybody's culture. So for me, ABBA Voyage it's a new form of simulation, in that those of you who've been, you're immersed in this world, but it's a film, but it's also a concert, because there are musicians playing there, young musicians. And it's really confusing, I found. And it's in the past, because you've got the picture of these people who because we all know them somehow, some of us, if you're older, you know them from the time, but they're as they were, but they're all still alive somewhere. Frida was 80 the other day, I found out. Not that I'm obsessed with ABBA or anything, but so it's a live thing and it's a virtual thing. So it seems to me it couldn't have happened because of the technology before, but it's bringing together, we're entangled in this kind of reality, and it's nostalgia, but it's also not nostalgia because it's new, and we're there as an audience and kind of interacting, and people dress up, which is, I didn't dress up, but I felt slightly out of place because I didn't. So it ignores, but it also embraces nostalgia, which is interesting for me. And there's a strangeness to it, because it's like 3D, but it's not. There's a kind of undecidability, which is part of, for me, what the post-digital does. There's an uncanniness to it, because it's not real, but it looks real. And for me, it was kind of the sensual overload, because it's so big and it's so loud, and those songs, even if you don't know those songs. And even if you start saying, well, I don't actually like this one, of course you do in the end. You can't go with it. So for me, there's a kind, and I have written a little bit about this, and I'm writing again about this. There's a series of oppositions and tensions it's there in ABBA, it's there in their name. The way that the bee wasn't, that was before they did the bee the other way around. But, you can't resolve these tensions. And I think that's where we are kind of in terms of the post-digital in the world. This is our kind of post-digital moment. When the director who did the initial work on ABBA Voyage talked about reversing the metaverse and bringing the digital into what he called the real world. Now, I would say the gap between the real world and the digital world isn't there anymore anyway, but there's something novel and interesting about bringing the digital to us, rather than usually we are in front of the screen doing digital things, really, to a certain extent. And in the article that's cited up there, I think we call it post-digital aura, which is drawing on I always like to get in a reference to Walter Benjamin, the kind of critical theorist, German critical theorist from the 30s. He talks about the strange weave of space and time. That's what ABBA Voyage is, but that's kind of what the post-digital is well for me. So if you haven't been to it, it's quite expensive, but it's worth it, really. I need to go again, I think, to a certain extent. So my last slide is, I was really proud of that picture. Can you imagine? Complete chance. Very small man in a lamp. We use this phrase in the kind of last chapter I wrote with Pete Bennett, called Beyond Our Depths, as a positive thing. This is what learning's about being beyond your depths. we borrowed it from Kafka. It's in one of Kafka's parables. The parable is the rewriting of the Song of the Sirens. Come back to this mortal coil again. So I'm going to summarize really quickly, and you can see if this makes sense. What we found from our research into post-digital schools, where we basically went in and we didn't ask people, are you post-digital, but we asked them how they engage with digital. What we found, we think, is that schools are much more post-digital than they realise, but not as post-digital as they need to be. So they're kind of, particularly young people are, because young people don't, it's not rocket science, but young people don't just learn in schools. I think, this is summarising the research, but also my thing, I think thoughts, there are 3 broad future paths for schools. And I wasn't sure about this next bit, but I'll go with it. The first one is a kind of individual model. It's kind of marketisation of the last 30, neoliberal marketisations of the last 30, 40 years, really, in that, inequality doesn't matter. Disadvantage doesn't matter. If, context doesn't matter. It's about if you get the good results, then you will win, that kind of thing. So that could well continue. What is slightly worrying is Super Trooper, side 1, track 5, me and I. The kind of individual thing, there is the kind of entrepreneurial. I don't even need to do school anymore or education. I'm going to make my money and become some kind of entrepreneur. There are other versions of that. AI comes into that. I thought of that only earlier. I was quite pleased with AI. AI, there's a danger that people think young people can learn only with AI, and where that's going to lead us, I don't know. There's also the ultimate of AI, taking out. Some people will say that AI will take over as a superior intelligence. We don't want to go into that one. The one I quite like, and I know the song is not a positive one, and there's the Alan Partridge stuff as well, but there's a kind of collaboration thing. That it's about collaboration, creativity, criticality, all of those things. I was going to say before, there's no magic bullets in education or anything else, really. If there are magic bullets, it's about collaboration, working together, learning from each other, getting beyond our depths, that kind of thing. That's, for me, what the future of schooling, and schooling is a strange word, might be. We shall see. So I think, and I know this is from research that I've done and others have done, most young people find it really difficult to imagine doing things differently, imagine the future at all. But certainly people who've done research on reimagining the school have found that young people find that really difficult because they're in that, in that really fixed model of what a school is. I know from talking to young people that they certainly don't feel listened to, and that's something that could be improved. And from recent research that we've been doing, young people are certainly very creative and ambitious, but they don't know how to get to realise their ambitions. And they need some more support there. So actually, I'll save that one. 2 things to say quickly. One, I think also, and this is studying in university, I think universities have become more like school over the last, since the time I've been working in them. It needs to be the other way around. So schools need to be more like universities used to be, I think, independent learning, that kind of thing. I can say that today, I think. I'm allowed to do that. And also, that word schooling it kind of implies process and uniformity and that kind of thing. School, there's an opportunity with the way that technologies work to kind of go beyond that. And I think we could almost use something as immersive and strange as Aber Voyage as a model for education, because it's about, engaging people. So another quote from Walter Benjamin, because I can. He said, it should be noted that there's no better starting point for thought than laughter. And you don't think of a German critical theorist like that way, do you? But I think it's an important point. It's about, learning shouldn't be hard work. Sometimes it should be hard work, but also it needs to be kind of pleasurable and enjoyable. And if we're worried about the way the world is generally, then, authoritarians and tyrants, the thing they like least is being laughed at. isn't it? So I think we need to, the last political point is we need to laugh more and get beyond our depths. If that kind of works. I think I'll stop there. Thank you all for listening.